Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Make Your ESG Actionable, Move Beyond Reporting. I am Chris Lees from Dataplan. Dataplan is a research think tank and consultancy born from a national expert panel during the pandemic, and we support organizations delivering complex change, tackling challenges like succeeding and demonstrating success with modern methods of construction, something that we did with the Building Better. We also help organizations really understand gender and leadership. We're currently doing research there with the Women in Social Housing group and other research partners. And digital transformation. We're currently helping Hyde with that. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Neil Gallagher, Director of Business Value at our partner, Cyferd. Neil has decades of experience in technology, data and analytics, and has been doing some fantastic work to move us all forward with some of the ESG challenges. We'll be hearing from Neil and taking a look at the Cyferd ESG Framework app shortly. Before I go any further, I'd just like to encourage people to take part by asking Q&A. Hopefully you'll be familiar enough with Zoom to know that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please click it, open up the Q&A and send us questions or comments or opinions throughout the webinar, and we'll try and keep some time at the end to discuss as many of those as we can. But rest assured, if there's anything that we don't get to, we will follow up with you after the event. To set the scene a little bit, when we consider ESG, there are several key factors. We need to understand the expectations and the impact. What do our customers, business partners in our supply chain and our investors expect? And what happens if we don't meet those expectations? We also need to understand what our goal is and how we will measure our progress towards the goal. There are many ESG frameworks that can help guide our thinking and track our progress at a high level. Things like the sustainability reporting standards, the social value bank, these kind of tools. We also need to consider our strategy and what is our ESG narrative? So the story that communicates what we are doing and why, and that influences our organizational behaviors and culture. And also we need to consider what support can we access. That might take the form of advisory services, it might be best practice guidance, and also funding, of course, things like the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. That might all sound very sensible, even obvious to those of you joining us today. So why is it so hard to shift the needle on ESG? Why do we struggle to get our senior leaders to do more than offer words of support? At the end of the day, coming up with the targets is relatively easy. What's harder is identifying suitable interventions to make progress towards the target and getting the backing to prioritize these interventions over other competing organizational initiatives. Our experience at Dataplan tells us that once you know what you want to do, getting it done requires two ingredients to be present. The first is transparency. It needs to be clear to everyone what is happening, when, why, and how well it's going. And the other ingredient is cultural assent. Your people need to agree with the plan and consent to the change. There's a lovely cartoon I saw earlier in the week with a speaker asking an audience, who wants change? And everybody puts a hand in the air. And then the speaker says, who wants to change? No hands. So we need that cultural assent to the change, not just the agreement that change is needed. At Dataplan, we can help you get to the strategy through understanding those expectations and impacts and set goals and measure progress and access the support. And we can also offer the development of that ESG narrative and the cultural change led by our team of psychologists who are experts in building cultures and managing change. So we can see a cycle of strategy development or review of the strategy, intervention planning, and monitoring and measurement. However, tracking this transparently in a way that remains actionable requires tooling. So what I would like to do now is hand over to Neil to talk to you about the work he's been doing at Cyferd and to show you the ESG Framework app that they have created. So Neil, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. And apologies, I'm still trying to find where the camera icon went as soon as I presented. There we go. Let people see me. So I'm delighted to be here today. As Chris mentioned, my background's got many years in analysing data, presenting data. I've got a background working for both vendors and in businesses as well. So if I start by giving a brief introduction to the company Cyferd, and then a very brief introduction to the platform. And then what really want to share today is the actual framework that we're talking around, and I'll explain how that reaches and helps you deliver some of the challenges, deliver again some of those challenges that Chris has been talking about. So Cyferd's a next generation digital transformation company. We have a software platform that's cloud-based that helps you accelerate those changes and removes a lot of the barriers that you might have to enacting change and transformation within your business. And we do that with our software. Our software itself is, as I mentioned, it's all cloud-based. You've got the ability to design and build or customize any type of business application that suits. More importantly, we can actually give you a template that does certain things as an accelerator to help you start things. We can connect to third-party applications via API or ODBC read for data, which means we can ingest data from some of those systems that you're probably collecting data from already for your ESG perspective. You can build any application, drag and drop as a user interface. We can create a data asset that can then get reusable. So we, as part of our ESG application that we've got as a template, have already built out a lot of this capability. In addition to having it as a cloud-based application, we can then publish anything to mobile. So whatever you build in the cloud is immediately available for you on mobile applications. Great if you've got field engineers putting in updates, etc. So Chris, as part of the introduction, was talking about some of those challenges. And when I first started working with organizations looking at the challenges they wanted to do, and that moving the needle, that point Chris made about how do you move the needle, it reminded me very much about my time when I was supporting a business, putting in place a balanced scorecard approach in finance. How do you change things to drive either behavioral change or drive benefits? So I decided to do some further research, and I wanted to give the citation for Robert Kaplan. Many of you will come across Robert Kaplan's balanced scorecard approach. He's actually got a Harvard Business Review article, and by all means reach out to us afterwards if you'd like us to talk you through that article, or you want to find a copy of it. It's only from last year, so it's not long ago. And what he's done is he's actually built a framework that helps you adapt the traditional balanced scorecard approach for the ESG era. And what we've done is we've taken a lot of the principles from there. I've summarized them all in one slide, but we've built out a template application that can actually track all that, and I'll demonstrate that application shortly. So those of you that are familiar with the balanced scorecard approach from Robert Kaplan will be familiar with some of these terms, and it's just he's adjusted it slightly for ESG. So he starts with an organization declaring usually a strategic vision. Many organizations I'm working with are talking about a strategic vision for sustainability for the year 2030 at the moment. Some go a little further and start talking longer term to 2050. Most organizations that I'm working with today are talking what they're going to do by 2030. They then take that vision, that's usually just a narrative statement, and then start building it down to identify a strategic outcome for environmental, a strategic outcome from social, and a strategic outcome around governance. Those three outcomes they then describe and define as to where they're at today. From there, what Robert Kaplan suggests is you then move down and identify a whole series of goals and assign those goals using traditional RACI approach against accountable resources, people that actually are budget holders or department heads that take responsibility. So those people then get assigned goals, and what I often see is a different number of goals being assigned for environmental areas, some around social and some around governance. And what we're doing with a lot of companies is helping them adapt to an industry standard. Nowadays, there are plenty of industry standards that you can go to, and that standard will tell you the most appropriate areas that you should be focusing on for ESG, not just the areas that are the easiest, but what's important for your industry. And I'll demonstrate some of those shortly. And then from those goals, those accountable resources usually create little projects. Robert Kaplan called them activities, then assign those activities to responsible resources. Most organizations I'm working with are doing this on an annual basis. So you assign an activity that you then track how it's progressing over an annual period. That's either a calendar year, a financial year, an academic year if you're an academic organization, etc. So it does vary, but you then just track that. You don't need to worry about the start times, dates, etc., but do it on an annual basis. And then once you've got those activities and you can track how people are progressing, Robert Kaplan then starts talking around measuring your progress towards your 2030 vision. This is quite important. A lot of people start with the KPIs and then just focus on measuring it. And one of the things Chris was saying is how do you move the needle? And a lot of organizations, when they're just focusing on the KPI, sadly, quite a lot of the KPIs for ESG are outcomes. And it's not easy to move an outcome just by focusing on it. You've got to break it down as to what are some of the other areas that you might want to focus on. So my summary, those accountable and responsible resources, what we often do within our application is publish the names of people, not the department name, but the name of the individual that are accountable for things. And from a behavioral science perspective, when somebody's name appears in a system, they take a lot more ownership from it than if it's just a department name. Track the updates, track the changes, and create a dashboard. You'll see how we've got the ability to bring in a dashboard as well. And then that other area that I was talking around, this is a piece that Robert Kaplan stresses quite a lot more with ESG than he did when he talked about it, the same approach for a balanced scorecard. He breaks down the types of activity you might want to do to focus on 3 different areas rather than just focusing on the strategic outcome. Sometimes you might need to enable or train resources. Sometimes it might be around a process innovation, or you might train the resources first and then do a process innovation. And in some cases, especially if you've got a complex supply chain, as I know a lot of you already have, you might want to actually include the value that you're delivering to those stakeholders in that supply chain as well. And keep the knowledge about where you're actually trying to get activities focused on one of these. And what Robert Kaplan suggests is you focus on the enablement areas first, and then process innovation, and then the value for the stakeholders before you then try and move the needle, as it were, for some strategic outcomes. So I think at this stage, it's probably useful for me to move to a demonstration of the application that we've built out. But just before I do that, many of you have seen this before. It's a legal disclaimer that many of our legal departments ask us just to show. And in summary, what it's suggesting is from what you see today, please do not use this to make an investment in any of the products or the services or the companies that we're describing. So don't make an investment on the basis of what I do say today in Harvard's Business Review. Cyferd's a private company, so you can't invest in Cyferd anyway. So I thought I'd at least show that, I've been asked to include that. So what I'd like to do is just show you now at that high level, our business application that allows you to track everything to do with sustainability and from different years. So you will change things year upon year. And the advantage we've built into this application, it lets you see where you are today, but also if you want to go back and move time back to see how did we start. In this case, we've got data going into our ESG application from 2020 when we first started. And this is all anonymized data, but fairly sensible, I hope you'll appreciate. So I've got 2022 is the current year. We're reviewing the plan as we are in 2022. Our strategic vision is a fairly generic term, as it often is, to grow and enhance our business sustainably. I can see that overall, we're sitting at 29.6% against our target that we've set for 2030. And it's important to also recognize those targets might evolve and change year upon year as well. So if we move to another year, we might change some of those targets. And that might mean I drop back against that when I start a new year. If I just simply scroll down, I can see where I am against my environmental progress, 27.4. I can see where I am against my overall social progress and against my governance. And then I've got a breakdown of some simple charts. Those simple charts just show against each of the metrics. In this case, for consistency, we've got 8 metrics being reported for environmental, 8 for social, and 8 for governance. We've got some customers that got 10 to 15 in each of the different areas, and some customers that have got a disparate volume in each. If I want, I can go and drill in quickly, but at this stage, I think to stick with the format and structure, we've got a strategic vision, we've got our overall summary of progress. So we might want to look at what are some of those outcomes that we're trying to target. I did describe we've got 1 in each, 1 for environmental, Again, the strategic outcome is to improve our environmental contribution. For social, it's invest in our employees, customers, and communities. Appreciate in the world of housing, you might want to swap customer for tenants. You might actually also, for social, talk about more than just the community, but also that supply chain, if that's important to you. On the governance side of things, we've got a statement here around enhance our sustainability governance. We can see where we can see I've got 3 goals against each of these outcome areas. I've got a number of KPIs. So I've got 8 KPIs that I'm monitoring against each, but I've got a different number of activities. And these are the actual individual projects that are going on. And against the overall, I can track the outline progress against each of these. And that's just a summary headline area. When I scroll down, I did say it's important to recognize the people. It's the people that will make the change happen. So here I've got some example names. They're all fictitious names, so I'm not breaching anyone's confidences. So I've got Bob Smith, that's the sales director. He's the owner of one of the goals. He's got 2 KPIs and 2 activities he's progressing. I've got Heather Smeagol, who's the head of compliance within the quality and compliance department. She's got 2 goals, 6 KPIs, and 5 different activities. So you can see how the activities now start to take ownership, and you've got people that have got responsibility and accountability for those areas. When I scroll right down, I get to see all the individual goals. So we have 8. So we've got 9, 3 for environment, 3 for social, and 3 for governance. You can see the generic names for these goals. So reduce greenhouse gas and energy, etc. Reduce supply chain environmental impact, reduce waste and improve recycling. Invest in social for employees, social for communities, and social for customers. And then on the governance side, we're talking about innovating products and services, enhancing business operational oversight, and ensuring legislative compliance. You'll have your own set of goals that will be slight variation, and they do vary a little by industry. I then get to see the overall status of all the different KPIs we have, the progress against our targets, who the accountable resources, the number of KPIs each has, the overall KPI progress, and then whether we're talking about doing things at a stakeholder, and in most cases in this example, it's at that stakeholder level rather than enablement, either a stakeholder or an outcome level. And then we get to see how many activities, the plan year, and the progress, etc. So hopefully that makes sense. So we started at the very top with a vision statement, grow and enhance our business sustainably. We broke that down into 3 strategic outcome areas with a statement against each, and from there broke it down against accountable resources, assigned those accountable resources against individual goals, and we have 9 different goals here. So from there, I can then move into the individual KPIs to see how we're progressing. And this is where the KPIs will all have slightly different units. There will be quite a few that are percentage based, but many aren't. So in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, it's in carbon dioxide, tons of CO2 per year. In the case of reducing health and safety incidents from a social perspective, it's the volume of incidents that we're tracking. You can see I've got a customer experience being tracked. Many of you will be capturing customer experience from a CSAT perspective as a percentage. Some of you might be doing it as a customer advocacy and NPS. So we can track the progress for that. And sitting in within each of these, we've got the target for the 2030, the current value, and where we started. And by having that, where did we start in 2020? Where are we trying to get to by 2030? We can identify an overall progress. So you can see we've got 25% progress for NPS, 15.4% for health and safety incidents, and 33.3% for greenhouse gas emissions. You can see how we can actually then start layering that up, and we've got a red, amber, green. So if my progress is not good, I can actually see exactly why. I've got the information in front of me. All of the information being pulled together in a set of KPIs. In this case, we've got 24 different KPIs, and then a similar set of breakdown of chart. In the yellow, we're showing last year's progress, and in the light blue, we're showing this year's progress. So we're getting to see that quite easily at a dashboard perspective. I did mention the activities and the progress. So here we can actually go in very quickly and easily just see the different activities we've got underway. We've got a lot of activities, so we can see who's got responsibility. So Judy Siteman is the site manager. She's got the responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our offices and site locations. I've got Petal Green within the environmental area to ensure suppliers use renewable energy. She's saying she's 25% of the way through that as an activity in the year 2022. And we can actually see exactly what's on track, what's behind schedule, etc. Can see we've got some that are actually ahead of plan. I've got one that's sitting as saying on hold. That might be an area where I might want to intervene and actually look to see, Mary Smiley, what's actually happening. So I can click on it. It'll take me straight into the underlying data. I can see I'm waiting for a survey system before we can start surveying some of our employees. So we understand what's happening there. If that's now been released, it's a very simple task just to update that and say it's now no longer on hold. It's behind plan because we're a bit behind schedule. I might want to update to say we're 15% of the way through. And I could, for instance, update and just say survey system now in place. Survey system in place. We can now start. So it's very easy just to put a simple update, save, it'll go and it'll immediately be updated. So that one that was on hold should disappear. I've got another one that's on hold. Again, it's awaiting a legal compliance. So that survey system, you can see how quick and easy it is to update the information. If I just go back up to my strategic, my KPI dashboard rather, what I can do is scroll down if I wanted. If I was responsible for social, I can just click and actually see all of the different social activities that we've got or KPIs. If I want to go into one of those to see progress against it, it's very easy for me to do that. Invest in communities, for example. This will bring up, show me the communities, show me what the current value is, £155,000 we're investing. I can see the target for 2030 has got £500,000. And when we started in 2020, it was only 125,000. I can also see last year's number, if that's of relevance and use, so you can see how we're progressing year upon year. On the right-hand side, I can see the goal that it links back to, so I can see exactly where I am. So this is one of the KPIs, but it links back to the social the invest in social for communities goal from that perspective. I can see I've got one activity linked to it as well, which is invest in community initiatives. I can see when that was updated, and I can see who's got responsibility for it, which is somebody called Deb, the DBA. So all quite useful from that perspective to let me get in at the detail level. If I go back to the overall area, there was one other area that is quite important for a lot of organizations, and that's to consider the importance. So I'm working with a number of people who are looking at ESG, not just from a sustainability perspective, but also from an investment to make their organization more attractive to external organizations. And here we've got the ability to bring in external industry frameworks. In this case, I've just brought in a generic one. It's the SASB. They allow me to upload multiple different industries. And then it identifies within that industry. So I've got a whole series of different industries being displayed: aerospace and defense, alcoholic beverage, biotech and pharmacy. And what they're doing is identifying under different ESG areas what they would consider to be material areas around sustainability for that industry. So what it's suggesting is that for supply chain management, an aerospace and defense company, that's not one of the most material areas. They would suggest material sourcing and efficiency, product design, lifecycle management, energy, and for example, hazardous and waste. So they identify the most significant things from an investment perspective. So I thought it was useful to at least show that and talk through that from that perspective. If I go back to my overall summary, it was letting me see making some good progress, letting me see areas that I've got some challenges around. I did say I've got the ability to go back and look at different years. So if I go back to the year 2020, when we first started on the journey, we had a slightly different approach. We didn't quite get as detailed. We were a bit more generic. So the vision that we had in 2020 was just to commence our sustainability journey. Whereas in the year 2022, it's about growing and enhancing our business. Last year in 2021, it's improve our business sustainably. And what you're finding is people are changing their targets and changing some of the visions and goals that they have year by year. And we've got the ability to track all of that, so you can do a year by year comparison. And in the year 2020, we hadn't got very far. We'd only got as far as 18% of the way through our plan by the end of the year. 11% environmental progress, just 9% for social, 37%. It's a bit higher in governance because we got some compliance areas that are either 100% or they're not. They'd be 0. So it's quite easy then to see the different slices year upon year. I have one customer that's now started to look quarter by quarter basis, and they just track that Q1 to Q2 to Q3 to Q4 within the year without changing necessarily the targets that they have, and they tend to only change the targets on an annual basis. Again, very easy for me to go back and look at 2022. I can see the vision statement that we've got currently. I can see where we're progressing. I can see that we might have some challenges around social. Very easy for anyone just to select social and see where are the challenges. I can see immediately. Improved diversity and inclusion is sitting there at only 8%. Investing in communities, again, only 8%. So I might want to go into one of these, diversity and inclusion. Who should I be speaking to? The resource data lead, I can see the goals, so I know who to speak to. Secure Steve around governance and security needs to actually help drive this activity forward. So if I just go right back up, the area that quite a lot of my senior execs that I speak to focus on is around that accountability. So who's got the accountability to drive some of the goals and the actions, and what they're finding, back to Chris's point, how do you move the needle? What a lot of my colleagues are explaining is that when they've got the people's names against the goals, against the individual goals, as well as just that summary of who's got what, then they're starting to see that people take much more ownership. And then if you do a monthly update or a monthly review from a governance perspective, or at least a quarterly review, rather than waiting to the end of the year. Chris did describe a lot of challenge. I do have a number of customers that explain towards the end of the year, when they're just about to start publishing or reviewing the report, that's when a lot of activity suddenly happens. And that can be a challenge for many organizations. So I thought it'd be quite useful if I just bring that slide back and summarize on that point again. So the focus, the summary, if you like, was that area about setting out the vision for 2030. Then from there, identify specific outcomes. When you get to 2030, how do you know you've achieved what you're going for? Those outcomes, those strategic sustainability outcomes you're aiming for. And then assign goals to accountable resources, people that are going to take that accountability to ensure it's delivered. And then from there, you can assign activities to responsible resources. Those activities are mini projects, and in some cases you might have 20, you might have 50. The volume of that might vary to suit each organization. And then lastly is the KPIs, the area that a lot of people focus on initially, and I would encourage you to think about the ownerships as well. The measure those KPI and the progress towards your 2030 vision. So I thought I'd finish on that summary slide, and happy to take, I can see there's Q&A questions. Got one I can see from Chris. So happy to field any questions. Quite quickly switch slides off so people can see.
Fantastic, thank you, Neil. Thanks for that walkthrough, very, very useful. We have got a few questions through, so I think they're all going to end up in your lap probably at the moment. Anyway, so maybe we can just kick it off. You mentioned a bit about the framework that you're using there. How did you choose that framework?
Yeah, I did. I had some familiarity with Robert Kaplan's work, having done some work. It was very finance oriented, and it was about 10 years ago. But it was a useful way to try and get people to take ownership. From what I'm understanding, a lot of people are struggling to get ESG to be moving, and I think it's all about people. I've done some studies. I did an MBA that looked around people and change management. And concluded that it's all about people. It's not about the data. It's not about the things that are getting done. It's really about the people taking responsibility and taking that ownership and accountability. So I thought there might be something in the balanced scorecard. I looked around different ESG frameworks, and I saw one or two that were based on Excel-based models. And when I started reviewing people that were using some of those Excel models, I'm going back almost a year now, I got people report. I could see people were getting corruptions, finding it difficult to track things in Excel. And then I decided to look to see, had anyone tried to apply Robert Kaplan's balanced scorecard approach? And I immediately found the Harvard Business Review article it was a godsend. It was exactly what I was looking for. It was Robert Kaplan saying this is how you could not just apply it but modify it so that it's applicable. And that was back probably at the start of this year that I discovered that, and that's when I first started thinking, oh, I wonder how I could do that. Having spoken to some people in the US, probably Harvard Business Review is probably more popular there. I don't know, but some people in the US are using that, and we're reporting some great progress.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I must say that we find in all sorts of areas that Kaplan's balanced scorecard is actually a really useful framework generally in terms of looking at performance against outcomes. It really, that idea of looking at the different perspectives, incredibly powerful. You did touch on something there. I'd like to do a bit of a follow-up question myself, if you don't mind, which is, why can't you just do all of this in Excel?
You probably can if you can control it. The challenge you've got is people, when they don't like the target that was set by somebody else, they have a knack in Excel of going in and changing it. What I did have one customer that had a struggle because they had a lot of Excel spreadsheets linked to other Excel spreadsheets, and then their ESG was sitting on top of that, and they actually started it, I think it's 2017, 2018, so it had been going for a while. But their challenges when they first started, it was all built out by one of their green environmentalists, and it had grown and grown and grown. Their challenge was that there was some macros that had been written in Excel, and they no longer knew where the original source was or had the skills to maintain it. So they got in a little bit of a challenge around that, partly because of attrition. The person had left. And I guess that was probably the real reason around it. But yes, you probably could do it in Excel. What I would say is when it's in a system, investors are much more comfortable around things being tracked more carefully. We did some work for one of the large US banks that were quite keen to be able to see, and it was them that put us in towards the SESB standard. They happened to use that along with Sustainalytics, so they were using two different industry standards and bringing in some of that. And Sustainalytics actually will do some external auditing on people's ESG claims, and they're using that from an investment perspective. So it was their suggestion to include what the industry standard was, not just your report against things. But yeah, the Excel one is a tricky one. You'll easily find some Excel templates. You can download them, you could use them, and if you've got a small department, that's probably fine. But if you're multiple sites, especially since post-pandemic, people are all remote, you probably don't have the same level of control. Whereas with a cloud-based system, we can actually identify who's got permission to update and change targets, when they're permitted to do so. So you only do it year upon year, not mid-year, suddenly change some targets, but also keep track of who made the changes. So we've got that audit log. So if you've got an auditor who wants to see where you've got to, we actually know who it was, went in and changed what, on what date. So we've got that whole auditable, traceable change. That you can have in Excel if you know exactly how to slice back through archives and versions. Yeah,
I mean, I am teasing you slightly. I think anybody who knows me will know that Excel is probably my my least favorite choice for this kind of thing. It has its place, it's got a role to play, but in my opinion, definitely not this. We have had a question about the commercials. So you know who you are. I'll be sending you a contract. You can obviously buy this. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to take that one offline, and we'll follow up with you right after the event. I mean, great if you want to buy it, but really this is an awareness raising of what's possible as much as anything else. But we'll definitely follow up with you on that on the commercials. Got another question come in as well here, Neil. I'm going to read it to you. The calculations and logic associated with KPIs are often a point of contention between those who are accountable and those who are taking action on the data. So how does the platform approach deal with this point in terms of transparency of the calculation, as well as providing enough detail for users to have assurance that their metric is accurate?
I love that question. In a previous life, I have done a fairly large amount of BI work for HR departments, where there's debates about how you calculate FTE and productivity and utilization. And I've just given a clue there. Utilization might not be the same as productivity. So what I did in that case was when there's two different definitions or competing views, you can calculate them both, publish them both, and choose which one you need to be using under what circumstance. So productivity versus utilization versus efficiency. I'm talking from an HR perspective. So if you've got similar competing views, we can actually codify them both in the calculation. The thing that we do with the Cyferd platform, we also create the data lineage. So we identify where the data's come from and what the calculation was. If somebody doesn't quite like that calculation, there's a different definition, we can track them both quite easily. My honest answer is, if it's driving the right behavior, let's not get hung up on the calculation. Let's, if it's doing the right thing, let's do the right thing for what we all need to do around saving the planet. It's a valid point. There can sometimes be conflicting views, including with supply chain. Supply chain is the one that's usually the different areas because there are contracts that drive certain behaviors. So my view would be capture them both, decide which one you need under what circumstances. It's really easy when you've got a tool that can have an automated calculation. So you could put both in and you could use them for slightly different circumstances, possibly even have different targets.
I think that's a great answer, Neil. And I think, that also speaks back to something I was saying in the introduction about having that appropriate ESG narrative, so you can build those behaviors and that culture so that actually people are starting to pull more in the same direction than necessarily having contention. And I think certainly all of the organizations that I've worked with around the ESG topics, mostly the E, to be honest, that seems to be where most of the focus is at the moment, but there's a very consistent theme, which is getting the culture right is a real challenge. So I definitely wouldn't underplay that. I think there's a natural follow-on question. We've had another question. I'm going to reword slightly because I think it links to that last question. In that last question that we were being asked about transparency. And I just wondered whether you could speak to how does this, so what you're showing is great if I'm managing ESG, but how is this going to be shared with my colleagues who might be more responsible for the actions? And what about the supply chain, or even sharing it with my customers and the wider public? How can I kind of share some of this stuff?
So there's probably two answers depending on what you're trying to do. And I should have also stressed, we can automate the collection of data if it's in systems. A lot of the ESG data is behavioral and people oriented. So the amount of interactions that you might have is probably not being recorded if it's a health and safety type of thing. But if you've got a system, we can automate the extraction of that data. And therefore the quality of it's going to be much higher. If you're relying on people to do inputs from time to time, you've got to be prepared that they might make a mistake or make changes. So what I often advocate, if you've got a supply chain and you've got information around supply chain, it's easy. It's a cloud-based system, it's easy to give them access either to the whole application or to the bit that's pertinent for themselves. If you've got end customers, what I tend to prefer is to see a release mechanism that you actually decide what you want to communicate. What you don't want is someone making a change in some data way downstream that has a spike or a trough in the way it's presented, and then suddenly it's out in the public domain. This type of sustainability data is not real time. It does take a bit of time to capture things, especially in a housing market, for example. So the loss of data, you wouldn't want to just drive a zero because you've got an automated process that's then publishing it on a website. So I would put a gating process in place as a suggestion about how you then release that. And that's relatively easy to do. We've got automated business flows that we could use to then publish that to a website, either on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis, or even annually if that's what you're looking for. But I would encourage that gate between it, if that makes sense. A review gate. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's actually the second time today the idea of gating data from integrations has come up as a necessary part of making sure data quality is okay. And I absolutely agree that it's essential and unfortunately not that commonly put in place. I also, hearing what you say there, just as an observation, I think there's, I know that quite a number of the people who are attending today are from the social housing sector. But I think for them particularly, but also possibly more widely, a lot of what you're describing here for ESG feels to me like it's a similar challenges to what we see in a lot of regulatory reporting, which of course part of ESG is in a way a form of regulatory reporting, certainly in some sectors. And I just wondered whether, or the extent to which that the tooling and the techniques that you've used in this could support that wider regulatory reporting type need or demand.
And that's probably a little easier for us because you've not got that same behavioral change that you're trying to enact. So that's the collation or ETL of data elements. So that type of thing is relatively easy for us to do. But again, you probably, from a compliance or from a regulatory perspective, you probably want to apply a gate and collection mechanisms and possibly even review points. So you might even have a process around how you actually review. And we can automate that process with alerting. So we have the ability, when information has been either ingested or been manually put in, that we can then trigger a workflow that then alerts somebody that there's a new status to be reviewed before you might want to publish that to your report, for example, or publish it to a regulator if you're looking to automate regulatory reporting.
Fantastic. So we're just coming up to the end now, so I think what I'll do is we'll wrap it up there. Really, thank you, Neil. Fascinating demonstration there. I am very excited about what you've done there. I think there's a lot of value in that, and hopefully it will allow organizations to take that next step, move beyond this, without wanting to be pejorative about it, this scrabble to try and pull together the data in order to just try and get our arms around what's happening and move towards a much more managed and visible approach to ESG that will help people actually turn that whole process into something that, as we said right at the outset, is more actionable. I know we've had one request for a bit more information, so as I mentioned earlier, we'll definitely follow up on that. If anybody else has any other questions that we've not managed to get to, I apologize for that, but we will follow up with any others that we've had to on the chat over the next few days with you directly. And we'll also be dropping you a follow-up email in a couple of days with a little bit of extra information. There's an interesting ESG paper that Cyferd have produced that we'll be sharing, as well as giving you Neil and my contact details should you have any other questions or anything you'd like to discuss with us. So on that note, thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much for everybody giving your time and coming along today. I hope you found it valuable. We will hopefully see you again very shortly.